Good morning to everyone. So my topic today is teaching science as a way of thinking. And I'm going to be talking about how one does this, why one needs to do it, and what does it entail. So before I begin, I would like each of you to take a minute because I understand that most of you are volunteer teachers across the country for the work that eVidya Loka does. So I'm sure you will all have some response to this. I want you to think of 2 or 3 topics in science that your students or even you have found difficult to grasp. Just jot them down in front of you. Any 2 or 3 topics in any branch of science that either your students found difficult to grasp or you, when you were taught it, you found difficult to grasp and now you are having to teach it as an eVidya Loka volunteer. I've said type them in the chat window here, but since we've disabled chat, no need to type them in the chat window. You can keep them in your private notebook. And we will return to these at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to begin with the webinar of teaching science as a way of thinking. So first I'd like to address the question, why do I think science should be taught in this manner? So if you agree with me that all action stems from thought, we say manasa, vacha, karmana. And if the learning of science is to effect a sustained change in behavior, then the teaching of science must aim to impact the process of thinking. If my thinking doesn't change, my behavior is not going to change. Otherwise, it is unlikely that science will develop problem-solving skills or enhance critical thinking. Then how, if that is the reason that we should teach science so that it actually alters one's thinking, how does one go about it? So here I would like to say that if we regard the process of making discoveries in science to be of much greater value than their content, then we will be on our way to placing scientific thinking center stage. I always like to say that in the English language, the word science is a noun. But I like to believe that we do science only when we treat science as a verb. It is in the thinking and the doing that there is science, not in the facts, which is mostly our emphasis, the way our textbooks are written, not all, but many. So I wish to submit that stories of scientific discoveries are a good way of going about this. So what is my suggested pedagogy? I would like to suggest that we employ storytelling of an actual scientific discovery as the entry point. And as we are telling the story, we highlight the thought process of the scientist concerned. I think anyone who has been a teacher even for a short while will agree that there's one of the best ways of gripping the attention of our students is by telling a story. Why students, even adults, who doesn't like a good story well told? So when there is a true story, it's even more powerful. And in science, if we are going to tell stories of scientific discoveries, every one of them is true. But if we tell the story in such a way that we keep highlighting what the scientist was thinking, then we intersperse the lesson with questions for discussion. And we lace it with activities and puzzles that serve to develop the same skills which that scientist in that story used. Then, what am I suggesting as the flow of the lesson? I'm saying let's begin with a true story. And it should contain participative activities which have steps where there is a demand to look, to ask, to think, and to do. I'm targeting simple language for primary children, what we normally in the scientific method call observation, inquiry, critical thinking, experimenting. I'm supplementing with simpler words, look, ask, think, and do. And then we go on to exploratory activities that build on these skills. They hone them. Look, ask, think, and do skills. And then we suggest ways in which the child can internalize this learning so as to impact day-to-day life. I still remember when I was in class 4, which you can see from my gray hair was more than half a century ago. We had a book, a textbook called Science in Everyday Life. It had as little to do with everyday life as anything could. Why I say this is because there was one chapter called Four Common Trees. Why has that stayed in my memory? Because three of those trees, the rain tree, the gulmohar tree, and the people tree, were on our school campus. And I found that so remarkable, because this was the first time I was seeing a connection between that dull, dry textbook and the world around me. No doubt today things have changed. There is a far greater connect between what there is in the textbook and outside. But I would like to submit that the pedagogy that I'm suggesting will bring in an even more deep connect. So I'm going to give you an example of my suggested pedagogy, which is invention of the stethoscope. I don't know how many of you know the story of how it was invented. And I wish to acknowledge Azim Premji Foundation, because this was part of the work I did during my early years there. We developed a digital learning material, a CD, where we actually demonstrated this pedagogy. So I'm going to tell you the story of the invention. René Laennec was a French physician, and he was apprenticed to his uncle. And at that time, the way physicians diagnosed the disease or the illness of a patient was by putting their ear to the chest of the patient and hearing the heartbeat, thump, thump, thump. And from that sound, they detected or diagnosed what the possible illness could be. So this was what René Laennec also learned from his uncle, and this is what he did. But one day, a fat lady came as his patient. And when she sat down in front of him in the patient chair, he was in a fix. Obviously, he couldn't put his ear to her chest. So he wondered, now what do I do? And then he suddenly remembered he had seen recently some children playing a game outdoors. What was that game? There was this big sheet of wood. And on one side of the wood, there were about 3 or 4 children. And on the other side, there was one child who was knocking on the piece of wood, tuck, 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 tuck. And on the other side, the 3 children were putting their ear to the wood and they were hearing the sound. Immediately, René Laennec made a connection. He said, aha, I've got an idea. So he looked around him. What did he have in his little clinic? He had a roll of paper. So he made that into a long cylinder. As you can see in the picture, he put one end of the paper, the cylinder, to her chest and the other end to his ear. Lo and behold, he could hear the heartbeat. So what did the scientists do? Actually, in the beginning, they used to just listen to different patients' heartbeats. And they observed that they sounded different, depending upon the nature of illness. And they used this knowledge to diagnose different illnesses. And they asked, when he could not listen to sounds from a patient's chest, he said, now what do I do? He asked a question. And he immediately made a connection to an old, seemingly unrelated memory of the children who played with this large sheet of wood. And he thought of an idea. He listened to the sounds from the patient's chest through a rolled up paper cylinder. And he tried out the idea. And it worked. So I'm going to play it for you. So if you heard a rather frightening sound, that was supposed to be the heartbeat. So he heard it. But now he had this impermanent tool. This is not going to work long. The paper is going to tear. So now he had to apply his mind to make something more permanent. And in the CD, we actually give a click and drag option for different materials, a plastic funnel, a wooden tube, a bamboo tube, a straw, and blah, blah. And say, click and drag and make the right combination. What do you think René Laennec made? But I'm telling you the story. So the final design he arrived at is not very different from the stethoscope that we use today. So I hope you're getting some idea of how the story and the pedagogy are being interwoven. So what kind of skills will such a lesson develop? Listening skills, because that's what the scientist used, and deductive skills. He made some deductions too, because he said from so-and-so sound, I think it's so-and-so illness. So these are the skills that this digital learning material tried to develop in the learner too. It began very simply by asking the learner to listen to different sounds and identify them. So here's an example. Quite simple. So there would be a number of sounds they would click on and a number of images, and they'd have to match, click and drag the sound to the image. Then they had to listen to sounds of different pitches. I hope you are able to see their different pitches. So they have to sequence them. So do you see what we are doing? We are going from the gross to the subtle. Then we have to listen to sounds of different coins falling and identify them. So there are three different denominations, a 50 paise coin, a 1 rupee coin and a 2 rupee coin. And they had to listen to them and identify the different sounds and match them with the denomination. They also had to listen to the sound of flowing water. Why did we choose these sounds? It will become clear in a moment. We then went on in that digital learning material to coming up with puzzles where the child had to use these different listening skills and deductive skills together. For instance, there is this puzzle called Help the Potter. There is a potter who is so busy making his pots that he doesn't have time to go and close the tap when his bucket of water gets full. So he calls a neighboring mouse and says, will you just help me? Just close that tap when the bucket gets full. Unfortunately, he chooses a visually challenged mouse. And that mouse speaks to the user of the CD and says, will you help me please? Will you listen to the sound of the water? And when the bucket gets full, will you just click on the screen? Because for me, the screen is black and the screen actually goes black at that point. And all they can hear is the sound of water. Now, do you see the connection? Why we had flowing water in the beginning? And I'm sure many of you would have noticed, even when you're filling your bottle of water from your AquaGuard filter at home, as the bottle gets filled, because of the air column becoming smaller and smaller, the sound changes. So the user has to click the mouse at exactly the point when the bucket gets full. It's a black screen. The user can't see it. The mouse says, the screen that you're seeing is the way I see the world. So can you help me? And obviously the CD has built into it certain prompts, like if you click too soon, it says, oh, bucket is not yet full. And if you click when the bucket overflowed, it says, oh no, the water got wasted. So they have time to try again to develop that exact point when the bucket gets full and they click. So they also use their deductive skills in another puzzle, which is called Who is Telling the Truth? And here there's a story of an oil merchant who sells oil and a flower girl, flower seller. She comes to buy oil. And there's some tussle between them about, she says, I gave you the proper change back. And the oil merchant says, no, you didn't. You're cheating me. So the mouse is called to resolve the issue. And the mouse, as usual, turns to the user of the CD and says, hey, can you help me? So there are a number of things that they have to use here, their senses. And the flower seller comes to purchase oil. She claims to have paid him a certain amount, but he says that she hasn't done so. So now they have to use the senses of sound. This is where the sound of the coins helps, because all they have to do is to listen to the sound of the coins which the oil merchant has and decide the denomination. And since they've already done this exercise and they know what each sound matches with, they are able to decide what is the total value of currency that the oil merchant has. There are some extra clues, like there is a fragrance in some coin, there is no fragrance in the other. And obviously, if the fragrance is there, it must have come by the touch of the flower seller's hand. So I'm just giving you a general idea of the puzzle. Now I go on to another example where such a pedagogy was employed, which is the story of William Harvey, the scientist who actually discovered the circulatory system. This was a story which I found remarkable when I read about it. Because apparently there was this wise man, so-called wise man, called Galen. And Galen, from the 2nd century AD down to the 16th century AD, people believed what he said simply because he was wise. And what did he say? He said blood is constantly manufactured in the liver. Now, why I find this remarkable is that nobody asked, not for 1 day or 2 days, but for 14 centuries. Nobody asked, if blood is continuously manufactured in the liver, where does the extra blood go? So you can imagine the kind of blindness with which we accept the words of those who we think are wise. Here was a man, William Harvey, in the 16th century, who dared to question this belief. He asked many other questions. He asked, in fish which have no lungs, what happens? In the embryos of lunged animals, what happens? Shouldn't all animals have one system for blood flow? And now he began to think. He thought deeply. He said, all warm-blooded animals must have one system for blood flow. The contraction of the heart is a muscular action, and that gets transferred to connected arteries. At that time, they knew that arteries and veins existed. That much they knew. He said, veins and arteries, they must be connected to each other. He just made a guess. And valves had been discovered. So he said, valves must be there because they direct the flow of blood in a particular direction. Blood can flow only in one direction when there's a valve. It can't flow in the other. And he said, maybe the heart is acting like a continuous pump. So now, he didn't just stop at thinking. He started experimenting. He performed experiments first on dissected frogs to actually see what was true. And he found that when he cut a vein in a frog, the blood was coming out at a certain rhythm in spurts. And he found that the rhythm in the way the blood was spurting out matched the rhythm of the beat of the heart. So he made a connection between the two. And he could measure how much blood was coming out per minute. He could measure the volume. So he made a simple calculation that if per minute this much is being produced, per hour how much will be produced, and per day how much will be produced. So he made a simple calculation to check if the liver could manufacture as much blood as was needed. He concluded that blood could not be manufactured continuously because it was absurd. He got a number which was so huge, it was 10 times more than the weight of the body of the frog. How is that possible? So he said, no, Galen was wrong. So now he did something very interesting. On his own body, he tied rubber bands at different parts of the body. And we all know that if you tie something tight, say around your upper arm, the blood stops flowing there. There is a bulge. And where the blood has come up to the point at which it has come up to and stopped flowing, what happens to the color there? It becomes red because the blood is there, it stopped. And below that, it's pale, the blood is not flowing. So all he did was, he performed experiments by tying his upper arm first and checking what happens to the blood flow. He deduced by tying, he tied all over, I'm just saying upper arm, but he tied every part of his body up, down, everywhere. And this is what he found. He said, the direction of flow seems to be, when the part of the body is below the neck, then it flows up. And when it is above the neck, it flows down. So he proposed the theory that blood was continuously pumped out of the heart and back to it. The heart is right below the neck. Today we know it, it seems so obvious. But look at the simplicity of the experiment of this man who first had the courage to question a belief that people believed for 14 centuries. So then in our digital learning material, which we prepared in Azim Premji Foundation, we actually said, let's make the child also think like William Harvey. So we gave them a problem like this. We said there are 3 residential areas and there are pipes supplying water to all the houses in these areas. The water flow is regulated using valves. There has been some leakage in the pipes and repair work is going on. For each area, you have to help the plumbers by reading the diagrams and solving the questions. There are different kinds of valves you will come across. The diagram shows how some of them work. So there's a straight valve, a T valve, and an X valve. So we gave them a puzzle like this. I'm just giving you one example. There are many. And we said, check the valves. We said, this is area 1. The plumbers have started repairing the leak and have closed valve A. Can you identify all the houses that receive water when valve A is closed? And we have H1, H2, H3, and H4. So they have to click on that option and submit. Just giving you one example. But I hope you realize, I hope you can see the connection between the skills that the scientist William Harvey used and the skills that we are trying to develop in the learner through such a puzzle. This is the two exemplars I've given of the pedagogy. Now, instead of the pedagogy, I would like to share with you more stories of scientists' discoveries. A very simple example, which is of photosynthesis. Nowadays, I think we teach children even in the second grade or maybe third grade. But I don't know if we ever share the story of how people discovered this unique capability of plants. So there was the first question that people asked, more specifically, Jan Baptista van Helmont in the 1600s. He asked, is water the source of energy in plants? And today it might seem like a very ridiculous question, but we must see that that is what we consciously add to plants. That's what we see as being added. So it seems like a very logical question to ask. Is water the source of energy? So you know what he did? He grew a willow tree in a pot for 5 years. What a patient man. And this was his finding at the end of 5 years. He found that the soil had changed very little. But the tree had increased in weight by 74 kgs. So he said water was the cause of increase in mass and the source of life in plants. Because the soil, nothing much had happened. And all he had done was kept adding water. So he said, okay, so water is the cause of increase in mass, and that's what is the source of life. But then came John Woodward. And he tried to test this finding. He did a series of experiments over 77 days. Now life has become faster paced from 5 years to 77 days. He was a little more scientific. He measured both the input and the output. So he measured the water consumed by the plants. Typical result, he did numerous experiments. He said one plant showed an increase in mass of 1 gram, but 76 kilos had been added to it over 77 days. So you can see the difference. The plant has only increased by 1 gram, but much more water has been added. So he concluded that most of the water escaped, and therefore water could not be the sole source of energy. So now came Priestley in 1771. And he took a sprig of mint. I've been corrected later saying it's not a sprig, a full plant he took, pudina, mint, in a closed space with a candle. And first what he did was, he lit the candle, he put the pudina and he closed it with a glass jar. After some time, the candle obviously got extinguished because oxygen had used a magnifying lens without lifting the glass jar. He allowed sunshine to concentrate on that candle wick. And you know what happens when sunshine is forced to converge through a converging lens? It is so powerful, it lit that candle again. When relit, it burnt well in the closed space that would previously not support combustion. Now, he concluded that that plant, that pudina, that mint has somehow changed the composition of the air. How did he conclude this? When he did the same experiment without the plant, the candle did not burn again. No matter how hard he tried to focus sunshine with a magnifying lens, it did not get relit. So he said this plant is doing something to the composition of the air. Now came a fourth experiment by Jan Ingenhousz in 1779. He took the plant, the candle, again like Priestley, but he said, I'm going to see the role of sunlight in helping this plant do whatever magic it's doing. We don't know what magic it's doing, but does sunlight have a role to play? So between the first and the second step of Priestley's experiment, namely the candle getting extinguished and it getting relit by focusing the sunlight, he had one additional step. He covered it with a black cloth. So in that waiting period, no sunlight was allowed to fall on the plant. And then when they removed the black cloth and they tried to relight the candle, it did not. When it was left uncovered, only it got lit up. When it was covered, it did not get lit up. So what is this telling us? Sunlight is very important for the plant to do whatever magic it's doing. If there is no sunlight, the plant cannot do its magic. So he concluded that in darkness, plants foul up the air like animals. They need light to purify the air. They use the word purify. Now, can you see, more than a century was spent in discovering what we in our textbooks show in one paragraph. Plants make their own food. In order to make their own food, they need air, sunlight, soil, and water. And the real meat of this whole beautiful mystery, which is in the story of the discovery, guess where it is? In a tiny paragraph in the side of the text, which many people may just gloss over because there's no time. I have to finish the portrait, photosynthesis, finished. What a tragedy. The whole beauty is in the verb, in the doing, in the discovering. But we'll mark the answer wrong if the child leaves one of those four. Say, you forgot soil or you forgot sunlight. But all of us have forgotten the beauty in the story of the discovery. Here's another example. Discovery of vitamins. Many people contributed to this discovery. Beriberi, you may have heard, is a disease which broke out in animals as well as human beings in the late 19th century. When Eichmann painstakingly tried to find the microorganisms responsible for this disease in laboratory chickens, he failed. You see, this is again very, very interesting because the human mind tends to work in a groove. This is a story which shows you exactly that. Why I'm saying this is, this was around the time that the germ theory had been discovered. Before that, they did not know that germs can cause disease. Once they discovered that germs can cause disease and the germs are airborne, everything they decided is due to germs because they couldn't think out of the box. So when they found that beriberi is a disease, they said, now which germ could be causing it? But they couldn't find the disease, the cause as germs, and this disease suddenly disappeared also. Those who had the disease suddenly disappeared. So Eichmann said, I'm going to look close. He found that the symptoms of the disease had developed during a period of 5 months. And during this period, the chickens which got the disease, their diet had been changed from unpolished to polished rice. But when they changed the diet back to unpolished rice, symptoms disappeared. Today, we know, by hindsight, we know very well why this happened. Unpolished rice has vitamin B, and the minute you polish rice, you remove vitamin B, and when you don't have vitamin B enough in your body, you will get beriberi. But please remember, at this time, they didn't know this yet. They were looking for the germs which were causing beriberi. So he asked, can I make chickens get the disease simply by changing their diet? So he subsequently found that he could induce the disease with a diet of hulled and polished rice, but he could cure it with a diet of whole rice, which is not polished. But he still could not draw the conclusion that this is a deficiency disease, because until then, only germ-causing diseases had been discovered. So you see the beauty. Somebody had to think that it is not only the presence of something that can cause a disease, even the absence of something can cause it. This required thinking out of the box. He could not do that. You can't blame him. It was too early. Now, enter second scientist. Eichmann spoke to Voderman of his findings. And Voderman, this reminded him, he made a connection. He had once seen that beriberi was never seen in some prisons, but it was seen in a lot of others. Now, prisons, it's interesting. You can feed animals, chickens, same diet. But human beings, you can't do that unless they are all encaged. They're in a prison. Prisoners can't demand shahi paneer and naan. Whatever they get, they have to eat. So in prisons, everybody is fed the same thing. So when you want to study diet, go there, go to prisons. So he thought, could this coincide with the type of rice that the inmates received? Whole or unpolished red rice, or peeled or polished white rice? So Voderman looked closely. It was a lot of work. He visited all the prisons on several islands in the Dutch East Indies. He collected specimens of the food given to the inmates. He personally checked records of the occurrence of beriberi. Who ate this? Who got it? Who ate it? Who did not get it? He made this detailed analysis, and he found a close correlation between a diet of polished rice and the occurrence of beriberi. Along came, still the story is not over. Third scientist, Hopkins, who was the first scientist to view the cell as a chemical machine. He had identified that there are certain essential ingredients that could not be manufactured by the body, but the body needed it. For example, amino acids. And he found some unknown trace substances, which he called accessory food factors. He found that they're present in milk. And he was the first to explain the concept of vitamins, vita, amino acids, amino, so vitamins. So now Eichmann and Hopkins in the late 19th, early 20th century, they had the courage to make a new and bold guess that was totally out of alignment with popularly held beliefs. What was this totally out of alignment, bold guess? The absence of some element in the food can cause disease. Based on their guess, they made a prediction about the outbreak of beriberi in patients who had eaten a certain diet. They tested their prediction and demonstrated that yes, this was indeed so. Now they proposed a theory that anybody could test. They could actually test whether when a food had a certain ingredient, it caused or didn't cause beriberi. So you can see that, that one line in our textbooks which says vitamins are very important. We have to eat vitamins. Without vitamin B, you will get beriberi. Can you see the amount of labor and the number of years, almost a century, that it took for scientists to learn this, to discover this? My next example is very topical, especially today during the COVID times when we are washing our hands numerous times in a day. This is the story of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, who is known as the father of infection control. In 1847, he is a physician, and he used to deliver babies from pregnant mothers in a hospital where there were 2 wards. And the pregnant mothers were wheeled to either of the 2 wards. One ward was attended to by medical students and physicians, and the other ward was attended to by midwives. So depending upon which ward was available, the pregnant mother was wheeled into one of them for delivery of the baby. Now, note something interesting. When Ignaz Semmelweis was in charge, he found that when mothers were being wheeled into the hospital, they begged him. They said, "Doctor, don't take us into the ward where medical students are delivering babies. Please take us to the ward where midwives are delivering." This puzzled him. He wondered why they're asking this. And then when he looked, he found that many mothers and babies died in the ward where medical students were delivering, but in the other one where midwives were delivering babies, many more mothers lived. Naturally, this is enough for any mother to say, "Don't send me to that ward." But he couldn't understand. He said, "Why is this happening?" So he asked why. He started thinking. Is there any difference in the handling of patients in these 2 cases? You will be shocked to know that this is 1847, and this was a time in Europe, in the western parts of the world, where they still didn't know that infection can be transferred through touch. They firmly believed that infection is only transferred through the air. Therefore, they did not think it necessary to wash their hands periodically, nor did they bathe every day. I don't know how many of you have read Jane Austen novels, which was before this period. The women in those novels, they didn't bathe every day. They put perfume all over, dressed beautifully, and went out to the ball. Okay. So why didn't they do that? Because they didn't think it was necessary. You don't transfer infection through touch. So when Ignaz Semmelweis, working during this period, asked the question, he looked more closely. And he found that before attending to mothers, medical students, they came after handling other sick patients. Actually, I've been a little polite here. I've written only this. But I'm sure you know, how do medical students learn human anatomy? By dissecting corpses, dead bodies. That's how they learn all the organs inside the human body. So the medical students dissected dead bodies And then without washing those hands, because they didn't know they had to, they came and delivered babies from pregnant mothers. Are you surprised that both the babies and the mothers died? However, midwives came after finishing cooking in the kitchen. And anyone, no matter which period in history, if they cook in the kitchen, they keep washing their hands with water. So whether they made chicken or they made sambar or dal, they washed their hands and then they came to the hospital to deliver babies. So their mothers and babies survived. So now he made a radical guess, Dr. Semmelweis. Why do I say radical? He went against the prevalent thinking, which takes so much courage. He made a guess and he said, could it be that the hands of the midwives are cleaner? So now he said, I'm going to act on this guess. And he asked medical students and physicians, both. He said, unless you wash your hands, you cannot come to deliver babies. He made it a rule. So everybody washed their hands and only then they delivered babies. Now what did he find? Lo and behold, same number of mothers lived in both the wards where the midwives delivered and the medical students delivered. You would think that he was awarded whatever is the equivalent of Nobel Prize at that time, right? He should have been lauded, awarded, celebrated. Well, you'll be shocked to know that he was thrown out of his job because the management said, how dare you make a policy without taking our permission? Infection is not transferred through touch. It is only transferred through the air. He died in a lunatic asylum, unrecognized. And more than half a century later, people realized what he said was true. And we owe it to Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Today, every time you wash your hands during the corona crisis, let us all say a mental thank you to this physician who did not receive the recognition he deserved. And so he concluded, hands transfer infection. And we need clean hands for delivering babies from pregnant mothers. And the argument from the management was, oh, no, there's a new ventilation system in the hospital and that is why there are fewer deaths. So in our digital learning material in Azim Premji Foundation, we pose this as a problem to the learner. We say, if you were Semmelweis, how would you prove to the management that it's not the ventilation, but it's because of, give a way of testing if the above is true. So what's my overview of the pedagogy? I'm almost done. We can throw it open Anand soon for the questions. I'm saying we must look at the steps, the verb in science of the discovery and see where the scientists concerned looked, asked, thought, did, guessed, verified, analyzed and problem solved. And I'm saying that behind every fact in the textbook, there are stories, hidden stories. Let us bring those stories out of hiding because no discovery can just drop from heaven. Somebody worked on it or somebody's, as you saw, many people. What are the possible outcomes if we use such a pedagogy? My submission is, and you are free to prove me wrong by trying it out, that the learner will develop an eye for bias and assumptions. They will become articulate inquirers. They will develop critical thinking skills. They will become critical readers and receivers of the media. And the media, especially today, is making so many claims. They will actually ask, what is the source of this? Who has data to prove this? If this is the trend, what does it mean? And they will become bold inquirers who will sift fact from opinion. They will become systematically deductive thinkers, maybe even problem solvers. For the teacher, of course, there are many implications. You are teachers who are listening to me. I'm just giving you a few. I'm saying if you want your student to ask questions, you have to facilitate that questioning and you have to do it in simple and clear language. If you want them to display a wide breadth of questions, you have to enable the students to see how a question can lead to more questions, how questions are connected to each other, there are linkages. If you want your learners to be capable of asking open-ended questions, not worrying about the right answer, you have to show that questions, there are many questions, just don't have a single correct answer. I think I would like to submit, this is my opinion, please disprove me, that we are obsessed in our country with the right answer. We have a correct answer syndrome. And this shuts the mouth of so many children. They are so scared to ask, but they don't know the right answer. Not only children, many teachers, they don't know the right answer, so they're scared. And we need to identify assumptions made in the asking of a question. Show that there are always assumptions behind any question. Here are some references. Of course, this is an old one, Michael Matthews. He has propagated for a long time how we must use history of science in the teaching of it. And the current example is Project Zero. Now I'd like to come to what were your difficult topics. I'm suggesting you take any of those topics and as your takeaway from this webinar, find out the stories behind the discoveries made for those facts underlying those topics. Try and plan a lesson which uses this framework of look, ask, think, and do, and think about likely activity or games that you can design. It's not something you can do overnight. We spent months preparing these learning materials. But if you want to align it with what I'm suggesting, you don't have to. Try and align it so that the same skills are drawn out of the learner. I'd like to acknowledge Azim Premji Foundation, and I now open it for Q&A.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a very rich presentation. I have also taken a lot of notes. So the questions are here. There are questions and they are coming. Shall I read it out and shall we go that way? Yes. So the first question comes, could you tell us a little more about ThinkingTeacher?
Yeah, certainly I can. ThinkingTeacher is an enterprise I started when I left Azim Premji University. I found that when I was working with teachers there, we were developing modules for workshops and we would go across the country and deliver these workshops. But there was a connect was missing, which was in planning the workshops, we seldom took the inputs of teachers on what they wanted. And in coming back from the workshop, we seldom followed up to see whether they did what we had suggested. So I found that there was a mismatch. When we tell teachers, you shouldn't think of a one-size-fits-all for children. We were doing exactly that with teachers. We were doing a one-size-fits-all. We were saying, whether you like it or not, here's what we want to teach you. And I was not happy with that. So in my last year in Azim Premji University, I conducted a research study to see whether the framework of action research was a more respectful way of engaging with teachers, where in action research, teachers themselves identify what troubles them, what they want to learn. And then they are facilitated through the framework of action research to come up with solutions. That was so successful, it resulted in a book called The Reflective Teacher, where we had worked with 7 teachers in the Azim Premji School in Uttarakhand. That I felt inspired to now work exactly in this area, because just in a short frame of 4 to 6 months, the teachers started turning much more reflective by using this. And it was not a one-size-fits-all. Each one worked on a different issue. So I started ThinkingTeacher saying, this is what I want to do. So ThinkingTeacher works with teachers in schools across the country in the area of reflective practice and action research, mainly, but many other things. Please visit our website for more.
There are 2 questions. I would club them. How to train teachers to develop scientific thinking? Any specific training in this regard? And another one that asks, can you share, how can I buy this digital curriculum or PPT?
Nothing is for sale. For the Azim Premji Foundation materials, you can write to them and ask them to share it with you. If you don't get it, I don't have it as a digital. I have it on my Google Drive. I'll have to share it with you on Google Drive. You want me to share this PPT? I think it's going to be up on YouTube or Facebook. Am I right, Anand?
Yes, yes.
And the other question was, how do we develop scientific temper in children? I'm submitting to you today, I've demonstrated to you one way of doing it. Yeah. And I can share with you some examples from my own experience. When I was teaching science to grade 3 in 1990, okay, 30 years ago, there was a textbook that children were following. This was in a school in Chennai, which had words like metamorphosis, which even for an adult are difficult to pronounce. And my 8-year-olds found, of course, it very difficult. So I decided, when I took one look at the textbook, I said, I'm going to use this as a book for them to learn difficult words. That's the purpose of this book. So I gave them all a dictionary. I said, all of you get your dictionary and underline difficult words and learn. So everybody said, teacher, I've got 20 words. I've got 15 words. I said, great. But when there was a topic like hygiene in the book, we did the curriculum. Only we didn't use the textbook. I said, okay, let's all ask questions now. What is hygiene? Okay, and those children would have a habit of sitting in class, I say, okay, damn, that's dirty. Everybody has to bring a soap to school and you must wash your hand as soon as you do something like this. So we did it. When we did germination, I said, okay, let's all do it. And we all do it, right? We have a little matchbox. We put a wet piece of cotton and a piece of a mung dal or a pea. And I can never forget when a child came up to me, an 8-year-old, I still remember her name, 30 years ago, Joan, she's still in touch with me. And she came to me the next day with shining eyes. Teacher, my seed, it has a root and it has a shoot. I can never forget, she made me see the miracle of life. I was much older than her, but she taught me what a wonder it is. And it is this wonder which is missing when you say plants need to have parts of a plant. It has a root and it has a shoot. And draw the diagram and label it. Do it and see the wonder. That is a marvelous way of bringing about not just scientific temper, but seeing the miracle of life.
That was a beautiful example, ma'am.
Thank you.
Here there is somebody, Panishri, is asking she says we have a rich heritage. For example, Konark Temple, the lodestone roofs, sun god levitating with magnets. There are such stories. So how do we present these to students? This is in the context of creating this wonder or giving these examples from the rich heritage.
So give me that example again. What was that example?
The Konark Sun Temple, where it is believed that there was a levitating idol that was set up between magnets.
So, I mean, I would state it in more general terms, not just the Konark. I would say any belief which has been held by people for a long time, if you want your students to question it, you have to do it with sensitivity and with rationale. Okay. So by sensitivity, I mean there is a certain respect you give to a culture which has held it. You don't immediately say bakwas. You say, okay, there must be some reason why they believed it. But if you want to question it, how do you think we can question this? So let's think of ways in which we can devise experiments to question whether this really happened. So my standard framework with children is, how will you find out? Can you read up about it? Can you do an experiment to test it? Can you ask people about it? And I would divide my class into groups and say, those who like to read, read. Those who like to ask, ask. Those who like to do, do. Now let's all get together and let's all share what we found. Another strategy is, there is one person who is saying, no, this is absolutely true. I believe it. Don't tell me anything against it. There's someone else who says, this is bakwas. I don't believe it. I pair them. I say, now you have to convince each other. Okay? And you have to convince each other without being offensive. You have to convince each other with evidence. This is science. What is the evidence you have for your claim? Back every claim with evidence. Then there's no need to fight.
Thank you, ma'am. So there is a question. This is by a teacher, I guess. How do we have to stick to the strategy advised by our school while teaching, or should we treat teaching as dealing with different minds and bringing them all together to introduce a concept? Like, do we put the importance? Whom do we place first? The strategy advised by the school or the children?
So this is a very subjective answer. My policy has always been to find a school who believes in the strategy that I believe and join that school. Okay. Because it's a losing battle if you're going to be fighting with a management who believes that it's rank and exam and results which is important, and you believe that it's the fun and the excitement and the learning which is important. You're never going to be able to convince them, okay? Unless you're really super duper, persuasive. So I always maintained it during my teaching career that if there was, you can't have exact overlap between what your management believes and what you believe, at least partial overlap. Ideally, you should have, great alignment, but at least partial. But if you're North Pole and South Pole, I quietly left such schools. I did not continue teaching there. So you do what you think is right, but I'm just telling you what worked for me.
A related question that says, syllabus completion is an obsession in teaching. This is something that teachers need to unlearn to be able to be more effective with children. What is your comment on that?
Yes. So in this regard, I would like to say that syllabus completion becomes an obsession, which I can understand, in the board exam classes. Because no matter how idealistic we are, We cannot subject those children who are going to take a board exam to our idealistic notions of doesn't matter if you don't cover the syllabus, doesn't matter if you fail the exam. I mean, that's heartless, right? They have to pass the exam. So my experience was, even in a Krishnamurti Foundation school, when I taught class 6 science, class 8 chemistry, and class 11 chemistry. In class 6, I had the whale of a time because I was not bound by a syllabus. They didn't have an exam in that school. In fact, exams started only in 8th grade. So I had a wonderful time. I was doing a very creative job. In the 8th standard, which was the first year of taking exam, I already started feeling the pinch of the syllabus. And by the time it came to 11th, I would take my 11th standard chemistry class and go home and ask myself, what am I doing different in a Krishnamurti Foundation school, which I have not done or done in a mainstream school? I frankly did nothing different because the syllabus, especially the ISC syllabus, was so overpowering. I simply had to transact it. So there's not much I could do. So my submission is, if you teach in the primary and middle school level in this exciting way, you have the children hooked. By the time they come to exam taking classes, they won't let you go by teaching them in a boring way. They'll say, Akka, we'll do this topic ourselves, but why don't you do it in an interesting way, the remaining topics? There's a lot that they can do on their own.
So this question connects to the last point that you mentioned. So there are people who feel that the concepts are introduced to children very early that they're barely able to grasp them.
No, I know.
So what do you suggest we do in such cases? For example, stories of discoveries like the examples you gave today. From when can that start, or how does it go to the lower classes?
Stories can start as early as 5 years. Which child doesn't like stories? Stories can start very early. You know, these concepts which are not aligned with the child's thinking. Unfortunately, nobody asks the teacher when they are designing curriculum and in drawing up a syllabus. The teacher is the one who knows best what is palatable for a 5-year-old and what is understandable by an 8-year-old. It's the teacher who knows. But no teacher is asked when a syllabus is drawn up. Syllabi and curriculum are designed by those who have never entered a classroom. This is a sad irony in our country. So I go by the rule, you know, if a child asks a question, the child is ready to hear the answer. May not be able to hear the rigorous answer with all the scientific terminology. But I hate giving a child the answer that it's not in this year's syllabus, you will get to know it in next year's syllabus. It's the worst answer you can give. I hated it when I was even in college. I've had professors tell me, it's not in your first year syllabus, you will know the answers. I have the question now, I can't wait. Tell me the answer now. I understand that there are certain terminologies and certain concepts which you need as a prerequisite before understanding the rigorous explanation. But in such instances, I compromise on rigor. I at least give a simplistic answer, and I invite you, there is a video on thinking like Archimedes in ThinkingTeacher website. It is a live demonstration with 6th graders, how they came up with Archimedes principle without using words like density, buoyancy, and so on. That's an example.
So somebody says it's wonderful to hear and understand the impact of teaching in this way. They ask, how do we as parents and teachers develop the scientific temper to be able to teach children?
So how do you develop? I mean, if you start asking questions, and don't take for granted that this is it, this is the Holy Bible or the Holy Quran. If you start asking everything, if you start questioning everything, and if you don't lose your sense of wonder, you don't have to teach it to your children. They'll see it from you and they'll imbibe it from you. If you are going to say fact number 1, fact number 2, fact number 3, they'll also do the same thing.
So as a teacher, when some students ask a certain questions and you don't know the answer, how do we handle it? They don't want to give the impression to the student that my teacher doesn't know the answer to my question. This seems to be
I'll draw from my experience. Yes. I have, as a teacher, on a few occasions, told my students, that's a very nice question. I don't know the answer. I will look it up and I will answer it to you tomorrow. While I say this, having said that, I must also say I didn't do this too often because by God's grace, I knew most of the answers. And I also know that if I did it too often, especially with younger children, they will lose the faith in the teacher. Okay, my teacher doesn't know anything. So a teacher has to balance. You have to be up to date. You have to read as much as you can. At the same time, you have to have the openness and the courage to say, this particular thing, I don't know, or I think I know, but I don't want to give you the wrong answer today. Let me check it up. I'll confirm it and I'll tell you tomorrow. You win their respect to that.
Can we reference to other subjects to promote interdisciplinary learning? Of course, there was an answer in your presentation where you said there are interrelated questions and all. So they ask how does one do it?
So how does one do it? First of all, the prerequisite to do it is that we ourselves should have a wide range of interests. The teacher, the one who's teaching, should be able to make these connections. And to make these connections, I should be interested in history, in geography, in music, in art. And as I'm teaching, I should remember, oh yeah, there's that connection, there's this connection. So I would answer, can we make connections? By saying we must make connections. Not can, we should. Because only then, because these divisions are all man-made, no? Learning and the mind is not fragmented. It's all one big whole. We made these divisions for convenience. We can always cross them.
When we look at examples from the past, like Da Vinci or any of those great minds, they never confined or called themselves belonging to one discipline.
So in this regard, I request you to read this beautiful book called The Invention of Nature. It's about Alexander Humboldt. Humboldt. Alexander Humboldt, The Invention of Nature. If ever there was an interdisciplinary mind, that's the mind. You have to read that.
Thank you, ma'am. There is somebody they're asking. I'll club the two. One is, how do we take this to rural India, where getting the children to school itself is a struggle, and another thing is what your experience in working with government teachers and government schools.
So rural India, I mean, the thing will be your language, right? When my experience was that there are two regional languages I can handle reasonably well, which are Hindi and Tamil. So I would work with such teachers bilingual or totally Hindi, totally Tamil. This pedagogy, I do the same thing. I would tell the story in Hindi or tell the story in Tamil. Yeah? And the examples that we use will differ. Because in rural India, you cannot always talk of smartphones. You cannot always talk of AquaGuard. You have to see what we have. So I'll give you an example. When I was teaching in the school in the Kalakshetra campus in Chennai, and I had to teach them third graders, the difference between rotation and revolution. I had to think of something which they could connect to. And this was a school where there were a lot of these very Hindu rituals. They would break a coconut every time there was a function, and they would do a Ganesh puja on campus. There was a Ganesh idol on the assembly grounds. So I said, okay, all of you, when you worship at home, how do you worship? So they said, we stand like this and we go around. We just, spin around on our own axis. I said, when you go to a temple, how do you worship? They said, we go around the idol. I said, so there you are. So I'm going to show you, let's do a demonstration. So one person came and stood as the Ganesha idol and somebody went around them. I said, now you're at the temple. This is revolution. And when you're at home, when you worship, how do you worship? You don't need the second person. This is rotation. So now it became an activity. For rotation, who's going to come? They'll say, oh, teacher, we don't need two people. We need only one. So that's right. So revolution, who's going to come? Teacher, me. Two of them will come. They got it immediately. So what I'm trying to say is your examples have to be contextual. If it's rural India, get acquainted with that context and give examples which are in their environment. If it's urban India, give examples which are urban.
Thank you, ma'am. In the interest of time, we'll take one last question and close. So they ask, there seems to be the scientific temper seems to be failing after school. Is that a difference between the colleges and all in other countries and in India? The scenario of teaching science, right? It is different in India and abroad. So is it because the scientific temper is lost at some point?
Well, I would like to question whether it was even acquired at any point. You have to acquire it to lose it. So I don't know whether it is lost at after school and they have it all through school. I would like to question the questioner. Have they found that it has been present all through school and then suddenly lost after school? The only difference I noticed when I went from India to do my PhD in America, the one big difference I noticed was Indian students were sound on their facts because they learned it all. They knew all the facts. Okay? But given an instrument, given a laser, given an experimental, we were shivering. We thought we were going to break everything. We don't know how to use these instruments. And the confidence of the American students was what I was struck. They probably knew in terms of facts, they probably knew less than us. But they would say, oh, I know this, I can handle it. And we would go and say, I know little bit. No matter how much we knew, we would be very underconfident. So it's confidence, I would say, which is a big minus in our schooling system. We are robbed of our confidence with our frightening exams.
Thank you, ma'am. There are still a number of questions. I think some are related to where to find the stories of inventions and all that. All these can be found.
Internet full of it. Full of
Yes. So more about Neeraja ma'am, you can find on the Thinking Teacher website, and the work they do, you can still refer to it. Thank you everyone for joining us, and it has been a very enriching session. There have been a lot of thank yous in the Q&A tab. I did not read them out because I had to search the questions in between the thank yous. Some are saying they have been smiling happily throughout the session, realizing certain things. Thank you very much, participants.
Somebody asked whether you will share the recording, so maybe you will tell them.
Yes, so everybody who has participated, right, to your email IDs, you will receive a link to the recording. That you will have it. It will be hosted on Evidyaloka's YouTube channel, and you will receive it by mail. That is a commitment from our side. Yes. Thank you.